We begin with the circle, the whole, the one, and in geometry, the sphere and the circle. Now, the sphere is infinite and paradoxical. A computer renders a sphere with a number of dots or lines. And the limitation is basically the computer chip, because even at 256 million dots or 256 million planes to generate the sphere, there's always a space between the dots. There's always a slight angle in the plane. And the alternative is 1. 1 is simultaneously an infinite number of lines, an infinite number of dots, and just 1. So we're dealing with something that can be infinitely complex and infinitely simple at the same time. We're also dealing with something that distributes and transports energy more efficiently than any other shape. We're dealing with one of the most common shapes in the universe, the circular rotation, the spherical shape. So what happens with the one? Because the one is unconscious. If you ask someone how they're feeling and they say everything, or one, they're also saying nothing. If you ask someone what's going on and they say it's all going on, it's the same as saying nothing is going on. When you're dealing with the one, the undifferentiated whole, it is by definition without language, without distinction, and thus without thought, and thus devoid of human consciousness. In order for consciousness to emerge, the one must be refracted through polarity, and then a system, a structure. And the system and the structure is conscious, but it is imperfect. The one is perfect. The complete, uninterrupted ecological whole is perfection, and it is beyond the scope, beyond the reach of human consciousness. 2 is incredibly crude. When you take the one and divide it into 2, and you have 2 parts that make a whole, it's incredibly crude, but it's also very conscious. One of the first things that we become aware of is good and bad, up and down, hot and cold, as polarities, as distinctions. Now, every cult in human history, of which there have been 10,000 and counting, has its own language, its own paradigms, and its own system of consciousness framed in that language, and a process. Now, that process is a process that includes birth, growth, dying, and death. It is a process that includes beginning and ending. It is a process that includes breathing in and breathing out. It is a process. And a process has to be refracted, first of all, to a level of complexity. You can think of the pixelation of a screen. If there are just 4 pixels on the screen, the image has to be refracted into black and white or black and yellow, etc., and into a 4-pixel resolution. If you have 1080p or 1080 pixels, then the picture can have thousands of distinct particles, bits, where the whole is cut into smaller pieces, the limit being set by the complexity of the system, which is set by the complexity of thought, which is set by the complexity of language. Now, the one can be broken down into 1 million particles, 1 million parts of a process, 1 million degrees in the transiting of the circle. But for a system to be complete, it must take us and our consciousness through an entire revolution of the system. In other words, for an experience of human emotion, one must transit all of the human feelings at some point in the system of feelings. If it's a system of color, you must go through all of the colors. If it's a system of life, you must be born, live, grow, etc., die, and ultimately cease to be coordinated as a physical body. So you could call a system a function of breath, that a good system will take you through a process that will reveal the limitations of the system. Because most systems are not balanced, and in that way they're not fair, they're asymmetrical, and no system is infinitely complex. So it's going to be dumbed down to a level where people can grasp it in human thought and thus grasp it in language, and have the willingness to give it that attention. So it's going to be somewhat dumb in that sense. It's also going to have some degree of symmetry, meaning you have to go through a revolution, but chauvinistic systems favor one part more than the other. And so there then is a tension or a battle to try and hold on to the breath but not exhale, to hold on to the inhale but not exhale. You could think of that as the life and death system, or to be happy and have happy thoughts but not have sad thoughts, or to, focus on this thing but not on this other thing. But for a system to be healed and whole, one must go through the probability field. And part of that, as consciousness and kind of learning the intelligence of a system, how much sustainable well-being is brought about as a result of that system, we want to occupy each role of the system, and from the perspective of each role in the system, iterate, develop the system of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, the system of identity, the system of the cult or culture, to something more complex. And as we move towards complexity, we move towards grace. And a good way to see that is by looking at car wheels. So this is a bumpy ride. That's a half of a wheel. This is also a bumpy ride. That's a three-part system. When you take the one and you cut away all but four distinctions, you create a very ungraceful ride. If you drive a car with square tires, it's very unpleasant. And so as that kind of square ride is developed into a more complex and yet further more and more complex system, you fill in these gaps with distinctions that are symmetrical. You move towards grace. Slowly, the circle is rebuilt through particles to form a more graceful, a more complex system. And that's a lot of, what we seem to be up to as human beings in the evolution and migration through different cultures.